I'd like to welcome everyone to this special panel on the special issue published by Identities, Global Studies in Culture and Power on Affective Control, the Emotional Life of Mobility Control in Europe. The speakers, which include the editors and contributors, are Ioana Verbescu from the University of Amsterdam, Bridget Anderson from the University of Bristol, Karina Tubere from the University of Barcelona, Alpa Palmer from University of Cambridge, and Melanie Griffiths from University of Birmingham. It'll be chaired by myself. I'm Aaron Winter at Lancaster University, and I'm co-editor of Identities.
Thank you so much, Aaron, and thank you for hosting this special issue within the Identities Journal. It was really an honor for us to be, putting up this special issue. And I have to say that it was a long way, but it was worth the ride all the way. It was a beautiful journey in this great company of all the authors and my co-editor, Bridget Anderson. And thank you so much for being with me and having me on board for this special issue.
So thanks also to the journal editors, and a big thanks to Ioana, who really was the motivating force, the driving force behind this special issue. I really learned a lot. I hadn't really ever worked on emotions, and yeah, it was just, I think it's a really interesting special issue. So I'm just really quickly going to touch on the three articles whose authors are not here, just to give you a sense also of the kind of breadth of what was done. And I'm going to have to apologize. I realize I don't know how to pronounce her second name because I've never actually said it. But the first article I want to mention is Aino Corvencia, who wrote on criminalizing Black solidarity, Dublin deportations, raids, and racial statecraft in southern Germany. So Aino's paper looks at how race is used to understand and to manage social conflict and policing, and how it also criminalizes dissent. So she looks particularly at 3 German asylum reception facilities that were raided by the police over some period of weeks in 2018, and how the police accused the Black migrant men of rioting in their responses to deportation enforcement. So she looks at court proceedings, the police and court statements, and ethnographic fieldwork, and describes really beautifully, I think, the kinds of solidarities that were exemplified by people within these detention centres. And she shows the importance of emotions in exercising state violence and deportation, and how it also helps to produce race by imagining this Black dangerous other which threatens a national white us, and how it's normal for this Black dangerous other to be exposed to deportation and policing. Katarina Rozaku, her article is called Ambivalent Feelings, Philotimo in the Greek Migration Regime, and she's also foregrounds race, and looks at the ambivalent feelings that police officers experience when they are dealing with migrants in Greece. So police officers in Greece are notorious for their racist and anti-migrant attitudes. And also migration governance sites in Greece are infamous for their poor conditions, and that includes poor conditions for police officers as well as for the people who are being held by those police officers. And she's particularly interested in the ways that police officers show care towards migrants and provide them with medicine, food, and other goods when they're not really supposed to. And she finds that this care is not really an exception to xenophobia and racism, but is cast in terms of philotimo, which means love of honor. So it's out of this love of honor that the police officers perform this care for migrants, and that and that therefore it doesn't really lead to, it doesn't challenge the dehumanization of the migration regime, but actually is in compliance with this nationalism. And finally, Lisa Maria Borelli, tracing the circulation of emotions in Swiss migration enforcement. So she kind of moves away somewhat from that street level bureaucrat and migrant encounter to looking at organizational encounters. And particularly she's looking at Switzerland and the relationships and encounters between migration offices on the one hand, and social services and legal counselling offices on the other. And so she's interested in how the different actors in these different arms of the state feel each other, and how they imagine the state and how they understand state logics regarding migrants and who migrants are. And the ways in which migration officials find themselves in the role of state defenders, and the other state actors find themselves in the role of, are cast in the role of do-gooders, and how actually working together this strengthens the immigration policies, encourage the strengthening of restrictions in terms of other particularly welfare services, which get increasingly reserved for citizens. So do read them. I think that they open up, I actually do really believe that they open up really interesting conversations around the working life of immigration policies and the troubled workplace of immigration enforcement, and perhaps can show us some of the cracks in the facade of the all-seeing rational state. I'll now hand over to Melanie.
Great, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this special edition. So I'd never previously thought very much about emotion in terms of my research, but was invited to by Joanna and Bridget. And I accepted that challenge, and I actually found it a really productive frame of analysis by which to sort of think through power and people's experiences and relationships. A bit like when I first thought about time, actually, I found it a really interesting way into all sorts of other issues. And so by accepting their challenge, I sat down and I thought about the last 15 years in which I've worked and researched and volunteered in different parts of different phases of the immigration and asylum system. And I thought about sort of where and why and how emotion had arisen, how immigration systems feel from different points of view, which kind of emotions are circulated and valued or obscured, and how emotions are regulated, evaluated or rejected, and who's permitted, expected, sometimes even required or prohibited from showing emotions, and which emotions. And when I started thinking about it, different memories in which emotions had come up in different encounters really started flowing. From sitting in on asylum appeals and the whole range of immigration judges who might be very friendly and sympathetic, or really bored, some very aggressive and impatient, and who often very explicitly said they didn't want emotion in the courtroom, and yet were deciding cases based on their own emotional responses, and indeed often assessing appellants' emotions as part of the court hearing. Likewise, immigration detention centres, institutions which often have a very strong sort of institutional dislike of emotion, with all sorts of sort of strikes and privileges systems, for example, to encourage certain kind of emotional behaviours and not others. And various times in which I've been asked to come and visit somebody in detention who was displaying very strong emotions, and I was kind of expected to somehow calm the person and keep their emotions in check, but actually was often confronted with people who were very emotional, but rightly very emotional, very angry and worried and frustrated. And I give an example in my article about a man who I visited, who was like that, and eventually was seen as sort of too emotionally problematic, and was sort of removed to a higher security detention centre. And also I've worked a lot with families who are being ripped apart by the immigration system and really going through absolute hell, and yet having to sort of quite emotionlessly accumulate evidence of their emotions and relations, and be met with a system that often tells them their families are fictitious, or their relationships, their feelings are instrumental, or simply just don't matter. And so sort of rather than this myth that we still have of Weberian sort of rational democracies, of very personal bureaucrats, actually we find migration controls are highly effective atmospheres. And we see this, of course, at the moment in the UK and elsewhere, with very febrile border politics and lots of nationalist xenophobic politics around the world, alongside a real callous neglect of people who cross borders. So I looked across kind of these policy and practice levels, and sort of from individual encounters to more systemic issues, and across judicial, administrative, enforcement, political kind of spaces, and at different aspects of the immigration law, asylum, detention, visa, Article 8, etc. And I use this to argue that there are 4 very strong emotions that really dominate across the breadth and the depth of the immigration systems, often really garishly so. But alongside these, there is this kind of chilling coldness and disinterest, and that this combination of these very strong febrile emotions and this disinterest not only characterize but actively produce immigration systems. And so I won't go into it here, but the 4 emotions that I say are particularly strong in the UK immigration system is suspicion, fear, disgust, and anger. And I look at how those 4 emotions sort of arise for those variously working in and creating the immigration system, and from all levels, sort of ministerial to frontline. But then I say alongside this very splenetic emotion, there is this, as I say, this kind of apathy and disinterest and disconnection or repression of emotions of both oneself and others. And I break this down into 4 different areas, saying there's a kind of a general apathy and ambivalence of people, a kind of such routine and extreme disinterest that Shiona York, for example, has called a racialized policy of indifference that the Home Office displays in the UK. But also a specific tendency to lessen and disbelieve and restrict migrants' emotions and their affective lives. So, for example, refuting or undervaluing people's feelings, and some people are particularly prone to having their emotions and their family lives rejected. So, for example, in some of the work I do, I look at racialized and criminalized men whose roles as fathers and husbands are really deemed either fictitious or just insignificant. Also that people subject to migration controls often have their displays of emotions ignored or prohibited. So various ways, as I've mentioned, in which there's institutional dislike of people displaying emotions, which are either sort of met with impatience, but sometimes also punishment, and various ways in which their feelings may also their displays of emotion may just be sort of completely not seen, as sort of blindness. And I give an example in the article of an appellant who came into an asylum appeal extremely ill, obviously very ill, and how everybody in the room sort of collectively, spontaneously ignored this, were completely blind for 40 minutes until the man spoke aloud the fact he was in a lot of pain, and then suddenly everyone could see what had been sort of abundantly evident, but not sort of collectively acknowledged. And so that links within this 4th area, in which I say that in parallel to sort of repressing or disinterest in migrants' emotions, there's a way in which immigration practitioners often engage in their own emotional detachment and distancing, and that this can be a coping strategy. Freud, for example, talked also around disavowal as a way of protective sort of disassociation. But that these aren't just private states of mind, these are part of how institutions and wider politics operate. And so the immigration system in the UK and elsewhere has built into it various ways in which practitioners are insulated from the people whose lives they're affecting, often not having to sort of directly interact with applicants, for things like externalising border or subcontracting responsibilities or layers of middlemen. And then various ways in which practitioners will find ways to avoid emotional connection, even if they do have to interact with a person. So sort of desensitization or dehumanization, or ways to sort of actually just not look in the eyes of somebody. And because emotions, they're felt within individual bodies, but as I understand them, they're not sort of individualized internal possessions, but they're produced through social interaction, and they're always intentional. They're part of how we make sense of each other, the world, how we make decisions. And so they're therefore necessarily bound up in power relations, social hierarchies, and there's very clear gendered, racialized and class biases to the interpretation and tolerance of other people's emotions. And so in the article, I then look at how emotions are managed, how practitioners read, gauge, evaluate people's emotions, also provoke or employ emotions, and that there are within the immigration system very different rules about who, which groups can show which emotions and in what ways. And so I look at sort of emotional evaluations, how some immigration categories require evidence of certain emotions. Asylum, you need to be shown to have credible amounts of fear. If you're Article 8 applications, relationships and intimacy is going to be evaluated. And in other immigration categories, the absence of feelings of intimacy is seen as very important, sort of in work or visit visas, for example. And I also look at how practitioners sort of draw and perform emotion and invoke and manipulate the emotion of each other. And just to sort of conclude a bit on this, so emotions are really important in producing the borders between the self and others, and so they're therefore necessarily integral to constructions of racial, gendered and class-based hierarchies. But they also produce national borders and their policies and practices. And so it's not surprising that emotions are integral to border control systems. And like modern nation states, I would say immigration systems are characterized by an effective regime of one of anxiety and insecurity, but also disgust, rejection and contempt, alongside this emotional repression and indifference. And indeed, it's not just that these are characteristic of the immigration system, but they actually produce it. And the relationships, the operations, roles and relationships within the immigration system, its categories, its hierarchies, its prejudices, including racial, and the way in which people and their cases are made intelligible and decided. And so that by appreciating effect, we can observe the materialization of power in the political and the role of effect in techniques of subjectification and the creation of racialized, deportable others. Because by degrading and dehumanizing those subject to immigration controls, emotional governance creates people who are deemed threatening, polluting, and also irrelevant, and makes them responsible for their own suffering. And so by looking at emotion, we can see how effect reestablishes both the power and the apathy of the state and its hierarchies of belonging, and ultimately legitimizes state violence and domination. But just to finish, I would also say that emotions offer us the opportunity to change the status quo. And that's why I think this special edition is really so important, because it reminds us that by looking at emotions and bringing emotions back into this sphere rather than apathy, emotion can be a way to which we humanize and connect, by which we can see people rather than immigration categories, and a way in which we can repoliticize the debate again and invoking action and solidarity. And ultimately, it would be through emotions that we can demolish the hold of racism and nationalism. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker will be Karina Tobire.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity to take part in this special issue. And thank you also for attending this session. I will be very brief, explaining a little bit my research in the last years in Barcelona, mostly with social services, for different reasons, because I try to understand how some inclusion programs are working, because they claim at least to and intend to build long-term relationships with migrants living in the city, closeness to them, kinship, and the goal of these programs was the inclusion of people in order to grant convivencia. This is a Spanish word that is conviviality. It's in fact a contradictory concept used at local level in Barcelona city, but it's like a sort of law in all local inclusion programs. Its meaning is being together, but at the same time, there is a sort of control of this togetherness, of the appearance, the aesthetic of the city and of the public space. So I also choose Barcelona because in the last 20 years, the city has seen itself as a welcoming city, offering programs to include refugees arriving to the city, and also different brands and different perceptions reconfigured the city and the relationship between its inhabitants. And the important word here is perceptions, as I will explain, because even if considered as dominated by strict regulations and internal rules, these social services interventions are in fact regulated by perceptions. And beyond these perceptions, we find different emotions. I follow the social services teams during their intervention in the street, and also I had the chance to see them from within in their office. So I talk in my article about annoyance, about mistrust, emotions not only exposed during the intervention in the street or within their office, but also what I've seen that is that these emotions are connected to a large narrative on migration. And there is a direct connection between the emotional life of these offices and of these social workers and the public discourse, the political discourse regarding migration on local level. Because if we follow, for example, the changes regarding these programs during the last years, we can see a lot of variation, but we can also see a stable narrative. And we can see directly the connection between this public discourse and the organization, the institution discourse. So I start, in fact, my research with two questions. The first one, it was how was possible that a large network of unconnected, in fact, social workers, police officers, lawyers, translators, they coordinate in order to decide about the presence, mobility, need of help, lack of help of a person considered as migrant in the city, a person that in fact they don't connect, and also there is no direct relation among them. I mean, among these different services, direct communication. So, because many times the communication between the departments is online, and also they don't know their users. So to some extent, they abstract on an ideal migrant, and then they codify it in protocols and evaluate its value. This was the relation I tried to follow when I went to their office. But when I follow them in the street, my question was, what do a practitioner employed by this municipal institution and this person considered or categorized as a migrant with precarious legal status, because I work basically with people without residency work permit in Barcelona. So what do they share when they meet face to face? So because they don't know each other, and the requirement of the inclusion program is to establish a very close bond. But also there is a totally unequal power relation, because this social worker has the power to decide the fate of over the fate of the migrant living in the street. So moving between the street and the office, just to go briefly to my findings. First of all, what is structural? I mean, the lack of access to work, housing market, that is a consequence of immigration law in the case of unhousing migrants in Barcelona city. So this structural context of lack of access to rights became relational. I mean, lived one-to-one, and the responsibility was placed on the individual. So in this way, I talk about the internal frontier and the affective states concepts that I borrow from the text of Anne Stoller. And this is a clear example on how the border operates on the level of individual subjectivity. The second finding of my research was that policing is not reduced anymore to the traditional police institution. We can see multiple services collaborating with the police forces and disseminating the same logic. And so policing expands within the territory, because I think I haven't mentioned the social services also collaborate with local police on sharing what is happening in the street. And also the emotional life of these services expose a very strong control of individual emotional life, a sort of emotional repression, because these social workers are also employees, and this control is manifested within also in a very authoritarian ways, not only in the street, but also within the organization. And this emotional repression also, I mean, who has the right to express emotions and when and how to express feelings. This is also an issue of power control, but is not seen only during their interventions in the street, but also they are exposed to the same control within their own offices. I don't know if maybe I have to stop.
Another minute if you want.
Okay. So what was very interesting is that within the organizations, I'm talking all the time about municipal social services. We see all this mix of organizational culture and work culture and narrative on migration. They are, when we have an emotional life display between these three elements, and each one has an influence in the decision that is taken regarding the access of people without documents and without access to house to city provisions and to the rights.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Alpa Parmar.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much to, in particular, Joanna and Bridget for their wonderful editing. I must admit my paper was twice the length that it should have been, so they were fantastically incisive in sharpening the analysis. So thank you, and also to the peer reviewers, which made it a much better paper than it started off as. So the impetus for my article was to, as with lots of my work on migration control, was to really think about how race features in migration control and the intersection of criminal justice. And this from a frustration with criminology, which is my kind of discipline where I'm situated. And my frustration comes from criminology's lack of engagement with race. So I was really excited to attend a sociology conference, which was called Feeling Race. And this was back in 2018, I think. And this was Eduardo Bonilla Silva's call to inject affect into the analysis of race. And I really felt inspired by that, and I was I was really excited to be invited to write on it for this special issue. So this is a kind of theoretical impetus for the piece, and the paper actually discusses research that I'd been conducting for some time on Operation Nexus. Now this was an initiative in England and Wales whereby immigration officers were placed in police custody suites, and the idea was to make swifter the identification of foreign national suspects who didn't have leave to remain and could therefore be diverted to the immigration system rather than pushed through the criminal justice system as a citizen would be. So I was observing that process. I'd interviewed police officers and immigration officers, as well as those subject to these questioning procedures as part of that research. So that's the empirical work that I draw on, and in particular in this piece I look at the quotes by immigration and police officers to think about affect and how emotions shaped their engagement with the people that they were processing, essentially. So arguably, as I said, the emotional registers of race and migration control have been less well explored, and so I really wanted to kind of try and map the racial economy of emotions, and particularly by those performing migration control. I also wanted to discuss the complexity and contradictions of those emotions in relation to racial minorities who are performing these immigration and policing roles. So that was something that is and was both challenging and difficult to both research and write about, particularly given the potential for implicating minority ethnic group people themselves in racist practices. So I was really aware of trying to do this carefully, but also being true to the fact that actually lots of immigration officers were from particularly Asian backgrounds, as were police custody officers. So I was interested in that dynamic, how their emotions shaped the way in which they performed their work and how they felt towards it. So theme more generally in my work has been to try and make explicit the ways in which race renews its material presence. And in this paper, I hoped to try and show how race latched on not only to emotions, but also the sensory. So sensorial experiences and emotions. So I think Melanie touched upon this, but you know, and I don't think I do it as well as I'd hoped to in the paper, but nevertheless, I was interested in trying to tease out how things like seeing and perception linked to emotions, and how I had examples of, for example, immigration officers claiming to see and not see race at the same time. The claim to not see race was often along post-racial lines, stating that they didn't take into account a person's skin colour and that they wouldn't acknowledge it as part of their visual register. But then with quick contradiction, officers would claim that they could look at someone and know or predict their ethnicity. So holding these two ideas together were not seen as contradictory, and rather as coherent. And in some ways, in comparison to my other research on general policing, this was different. And it seemed as though that the performance of immigration control in particular enabled this denial of racism, which David Goldberg and others have talked about. The emotional ambivalence of the work that officers did was revealed in the interviews and observations that I conducted. Some officers acknowledged that their work was regarded as racist and that they found this difficult to contend with, alongside the difficulties of performing the tasks that they were. Feelings of guilt, acknowledgement of social disapprobation about the work they did were acknowledged, but also compartmentalized in order for the officers to actually do their day-to-day work. And the strategies, the emotional cutting off strategies that were employed was something that was interesting, and almost to distance themselves from the racialized implications of what they were doing, the decisions that they were making. So in terms of the sensory shifts and their potentially racialized meaning, so as I've said, this is quite tricky, but I'm referring here to things like gazes that lasted a little bit too long that I observed in certain situations, uncomfortable silences, sweating, things that Claudia Rankin has discussed in terms of bioaccumulations that then produce sensory shifts. Now, we can't all, of course, be certain that these are partly or wholly due to race or racist situations, but the fact is that they might be. And this possibility of them being racialized and that very ambiguity was disconcerting in itself, is what I noticed in these situations. So the contingent nature of emotions, and in particular racialized emotions, are difficult to make visible, and this is what I was trying to do in the paper. And what I found was that racialized emotions in particular attract specific kinds of scrutiny, in the way that the default position is often to try and explain race away, rather than to acknowledge its reality and presence, and in this case, for emotions to be based in race. So, you know, I was once presenting this work and I was asked, well, but how is an emotion racialized? How can you tell that it's racialized? And I found that those kinds of questions were asked of when you were making claims about race, more so than about things like more generalized anger or so on. So that was interesting. So to give an example of how, you know, I tried to link race and the sensory. So Laura Allen Stoller has talked about how racial distinctions are tethered to sensory distinctions of smell, sound, and comportment, and actually underwrite the racialized assessments validated in new racisms today. So in the research, I described how I heard officers talk about the smells in police custody, referring to aromas that lingered after a group of Somali men had been brought in. Noises and loudness were referred to with racialized judgments that were embedded in these comments too. Also, as I said, I was interested in the strategies that were adopted by minority ethnic group officers who were from a migration background themselves. So there was a sense of disassociation on their part. Officers themselves would regard their own and their parents' plight as much worth and therefore more genuine, which enabled them to do their work and be sometimes quite harsh towards people who are from very similar backgrounds from themselves or their parents. So there's this evaluative role that was undertaken by officers in order to deny their feeling sympathy or empathy with those that they were working with. Others talked openly of their sadness and betrayal that they felt performing their role, and sometimes it was the same individuals who were describing both of these things. And I also touch on issues of pleasure and vindication that some officers described in performing their work. Obviously difficult to untangle and hear, but there were, for example, Yvonne, an immigration officer, said that she enjoyed her work because it gave her a chance to put things in order. The governments over the years have let things get out of control. I take pride and pleasure in getting things back on track. I feel I'm in an important position. So that power imbued with pleasure. And the pleasure of punishment is something that's been talked about in the criminal justice literature a fair amount. And lastly, the complicity with the racist immigration regime and how it made officers feel in my research, I felt linked to Bridget's work actually about this non-binary and shifting conception of us and them when exploring the dynamics, politics, and emotions of immigration control. And that seemed particularly important to understanding this movement or scrambling of the line when bringing together analyses of race and effect, both of which are very much characterized by their inherent mutability. So I shall stop there, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Joanna.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Aaron, for giving me this opportunity to talk about my own article. Detention is morally exhausting. Melancholia of detention centers in France. I built this article on my fieldwork in France, 2016, 2018. I've spent some times in and around mostly detention centers in Paris. And I was talking a lot with the police personnel who is guarding the detention centers, belong to the border police in France, and with the NGO workers who are allowed to work with detained migrants inside the detention centers. And I have to say that it was like one of the last pieces of how to make sense of my fieldwork, because it stayed with me so much what happened there and how I witnessed whatever the others were telling me that are living inside the detention centers. And by the others, of course, I don't mean the migrants themselves, because that's, so much talked about it, and the harshness and the terrible conditions that are in the detention centers, especially in France. It's a well-known fact and well documented, but still nothing happens at the political or in legal terms. So my question around this phenomena, France being having the biggest detention apparatus in Europe currently, and back then as well. However, they don't do as many deportation as they have detainees. So it was a gap in technical terms, but I wanted to understand who are those people who are working inside the detention center and what's happening for them. What does it take to work there? And it takes a lot. That was something that it took me a while to understand, how they are confronted with each other and they confront with themselves by just being there. And this kind of tensions was visible in so many ways. And the fact that you have these heated emotions and the cynicism of this horrendous regime of detention in France that nobody can politically oppose anymore. It was a deep question of how is this happening. So my initial inspection of this socially philosophical notion led me to two different paths. First of all, to understand the meaning of the legal system, and this is why I call the legalistic gaze that it's so evident in the French context. And I'm going to explain it in a second. And then it's the melancholia, an organizational feeling. And there were other authors that discussed this in different other contexts. And for me, it was very important to bring it within this specific environment, this specific organization of detention in France. It was something that had to do with the understanding of the law on the one hand, and also the physicality of the corridors and the detention themselves and the courtyards and the courts that are different in moving between the administrative court or the judicial court, and meeting different types of police officers responsible for the detainees. And at the same time, a lot of other civil servants, like the NGO workers, who balance between doing a humanitarian work or just a legal service providers, which in a way they try to explain it that it's very different than just humanitarian work, by basically taking away something of a human connection while doing that, and preserving a normativity and a righteousness of and neutrality of providing these services. Of course, it was not their option. It was something that developed throughout some decades since the detention is legalized in France. But the way that the workers themselves, they had to explain why do they do what they do, that was something relevant, the way that they understood that. So on the one hand, we have the legalistic gaze that all the parties involved, from the police officers to the NGO workers or any other workers there, like nurses or those who are providing, the food or the cleaning inside the detention center. So everybody was doing what they are doing because they believed that the law, it's maybe not fair, but we do have to respect the law. That was the condition of doing it. And that it's based on Republicanist thinking of what the state is in the French context. That's on the one hand. And then I'm trying to understand what kind of organizational feeling it gives. And I had to make sense on especially this intersection between heated emotions and then clear-minded, practical tasks that people do have. And by having to manage a lot of contradictions in their daily work. So is that according to the law or not? I will just give now from the top of my head an example that the NGO workers had to go and take the keys to enter their own office, that it was inside the detention centers, although separate from the detainees. And for that, they had to ask the key from the border police. And some of them, they were willing and saying, yeah, sure, you can come and pick it up from there. And others will say, no, don't step into my office because this is the border police. I will give you the key whenever I'm ready for you. So this kind of tensions that they are created all the time. And why and how is that workable at the end of the day? So then I'm trying to rescue this concept of melancholia in the sense that people do manage to bring it, to combine these heated emotions and moral paralysis. And that's something that it shows how the liberal democracy accepts a lot of whatever otherwise would be called torture or bad treatment or discrimination, not only towards the migrants, but also within the apparatus of detention. And all of a sudden, this kind of paralysis that is created there, it shows that the law is not good, but we have to respect it. And then with all the efforts to circumvent it, we have to acknowledge it, respect it, and live with it. And this, it is what I call melancholia, in the sense that people do prefer to do. I don't think that they prefer, but this is what happens in practice. They kind of, it's beyond cynical action. It's something of a way of being unable to act politically in a situation of so much injustice. And then to reserve oneself to perform the daily task with the hope that maybe somewhere, somehow, things will be back on a more humane path. So that would be my short description of this article. And I know that I struggled a lot to make it so short, because sometimes I wanted to explain much more this and much more that, and there were never enough words to explain, what kind of legal violence and how to explain that, and what does that do to people's morality and moral righteousness, and how that at the end creates this atmosphere of melancholia that you can feel it and understand it at a certain point in detention centers. So I think I should stop here. I don't know how many minutes do I still have or not.
Another minute if you wanted to.
Okay, yeah, then I can say 2 more words. So I think that it's quite important, this organizational culture of detention. I'm trying my best to bring a sort of a vision about the fact that organizations, they do live beyond the individuals that are there, but they are created by every one of those people who are part of it and who take part in building that organization. It's not easy for people to understand that and to make this separation, because nobody wants to be on the evil side. So in detention center in particular, whereas it's so obvious that what happens there, it's so inhumane and so unjust, but they do go back to the law in order to rescue their own morality and their own soul in that sense. So to try to escape this cruelty of the law, they do need to put the law as a buffer between themselves and their own ethics. And what happens there, that it takes away somehow their own individual responsibility. And that happens on all sides. So all the participants is not only even if in ideological positions, they do stand on different grounds. The police officers will always defend the state, and the NGO workers, balancing between their legal services and humanitarian tasks, they think that they are on the other side. However, within this environment, this organization, they are both trying to rescue their soul in the more or less the same way by calling it on the law as that should be changed in order to have another life for everyone, and especially those who are most affected, the migrant detainees. So the atmosphere of melancholia is a moral duty that holds on these ideals of a better humanity that can be shared, but at the same time, it acknowledges this political inability to act, and it's a contradictory and at the same time a lived experience within that particular climate of detention centers. But I think I will stop here. I hope to hear much more about the emotions and how they show us how people do move against or along what they think it's morally just or unjust. So I think it's a lot to uncover and unpack there. So thank you for that.